There is a place on Earth where the ground itself holds more power than any army, any government, or any nuclear weapon ever built. Every morning, 200 million Americans wake up, get in their cars and drive. They don't think about it. They don't question it. But every single mile they travel, every single gallon they pump, traces back to a decision made by a small group of men sitting in a room in a desert thousands of miles away. This is the story of how the Desert Kings built the most powerful economic cartel in human history. How they took the world's most essential resource and turned it into a weapon. And how, even today, they hold the global economy in the palm of their hand. The year was 1938. The Arabian Peninsula was one of the most desolate places on Earth. No railways, no highways, no industry, just sand, heat, and a kingdom so desperately poor that its ruler, King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, could barely afford to pay his own government officials. Then the Americans arrived. A company called Standard Oil of California had been quietly negotiating drilling rights across the eastern desert. The Saudis agreed, not because they believed there was oil, but because they needed the money from the deal itself. They thought the Americans were chasing a fantasy. They were wrong. On March 4, 1938, a drill at a site called Dammam Well No. 7 struck something that would rewrite the history of the modern world. Black crude oil erupted from the ground with a force that stunned even the most experienced geologists on the team. They kept drilling. More oil. They moved the drill. More oil. They expanded the search across hundreds of miles of desert and found the same thing everywhere they looked. The Arabian Peninsula was sitting on top of the largest oil reserve ever discovered in human history. Overnight, Saudi Arabia went from one of the poorest kingdoms on Earth to the owner of the most valuable geological asset the planet had ever produced. But there was a problem. The Saudis didn't own the oil. Not really. The Americans did. Standard Oil, which later became the Arabian American Oil Company, known as Aramco, controlled the drilling, the refining, the shipping, and the pricing. Saudi Arabia owned the land, but the profits flowed west. For decades, the Desert Kings watched foreign corporations extract their country's greatest treasure and take the majority of the wealth back to America. That arrangement was about to change, and when it did, it would shake the entire world. By 1960, the same story was playing out across the Middle East. Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Venezuela, all sitting on massive oil reserves. All watching foreign oil companies set prices, control supply, and pocket the profits. The producing nations had no say, no power, no leverage. That changed on September 14, 1960, in Baghdad, Iraq. 5 nations, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, and Venezuela, sent their representatives to a single meeting. They had one agenda: stop letting foreign corporations control the price of their oil. What they formed that day was called the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. The world would come to know it by its acronym, OPEC. In its early years, OPEC was largely ignored by the West. The major oil companies, known as the Seven Sisters, a group that included Exxon, Shell, and Chevron, dismissed it as a talking club with no real teeth. Oil prices remained low. Western economies boomed. The Desert Kings were still waiting for their moment. That moment came in October 1973. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise military attack on Israel. It became known as the Yom Kippur War. The United States, under President Nixon, rushed military supplies to Israel to prevent its defeat. OPEC's Arab members watched this unfold and made a decision that would become one of the most consequential economic moves of the 20th century. They turned off the tap. Saudi Arabia, along with the Arab members of OPEC, announced an immediate oil embargo against the United States and any other nation supporting Israel. They cut oil production by 5% per month. They banned oil exports to America entirely. Within weeks, the impact was catastrophic. Gas stations across the United States ran dry. Cars lined up for miles, waiting hours for the chance to fill a tank. The government introduced odd-even rationing. Your license plate determined which days you could buy gas. The price of oil quadrupled in a matter of months. The American economy, built entirely on cheap energy, buckled. For the first time in history, a group of developing nations had brought the most powerful country on earth to its knees, not with missiles or armies, but with a resource sitting beneath their sand. The lesson of 1973 echoed through every boardroom and government office in the Western world. Whoever controls the oil controls the world. The 1973 embargo changed everything. Saudi Arabia, in particular, realized it was no longer just a partner to the Western oil companies. It was the most important energy supplier on the planet. Throughout the 1970s, Saudi Arabia began a process called nationalization. Step by step, the Saudi government took ownership of Aramco away from its American founders. By 1980, Saudi Arabia owned 100% of the company. They renamed it Saudi Aramco. What they inherited was staggering. Saudi Aramco didn't just have oil wells. It had the Ghawar field, the single largest conventional oil field ever discovered, stretching over 100 miles beneath the eastern desert, producing more oil per day than most countries produce in total. It had the world's largest oil processing facility, OPEC, capable of processing 7% of the entire world's oil supply in a single location. It had its own ports, its own pipelines, its own refineries, its own fleet of tankers. Saudi Aramco was not a company in the traditional sense. It was a sovereign economic weapon. And the man who would eventually bring it to the world's attention would do so in a way nobody expected. For decades, Saudi Aramco operated in near total secrecy. No public filings, no outside shareholders, no transparency about its reserves, its production costs, or its profits. It existed outside the normal rules of global capitalism, protected by the Saudi state, and answerable to no one but the royal family. Then, in 2016, a young and ambitious Saudi prince named Mohammed bin Salman, known to the world as Membiez, made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the global financial system. He was going to take Saudi Aramco public. The initial public offering, which finally happened in December 2019, raised $25 billion in a single day, the largest IPO in human history. At its peak valuation, Saudi Aramco was worth over $2 trillion. That made it more valuable than Apple, more valuable than Microsoft, more valuable than Amazon. It was the most valuable company ever listed on any stock exchange in the history of the world. A single company, built on a single resource, sitting under a single desert. Today, OPEC and its expanded alliance, known as OPEC+, which includes Russia, controls approximately 40% of the world's oil production. But their influence goes far beyond the barrels they pump. When OPEC decides to cut production, global oil prices rise. When prices rise, everything else rises with them: food, transportation, manufacturing, electricity. The cost of getting any product from a factory to a store involves oil at every single step. A decision made in a meeting room in Vienna, where OPEC holds its summits, can trigger inflation in every economy on Earth within weeks. In 2022, the world saw this play out in real time. Russia's invasion of Ukraine caused a scramble for energy supplies. The United States asked Saudi Arabia to pump more oil to stabilize global prices. Saudi Arabia said no. Embeers did not take President Biden's call for weeks. And when they finally spoke, nothing changed. A desert kingdom with a population smaller than the state of Texas, told the most powerful nation on earth to wait. That is the reality of OPEC's power. It is not just economic, it is geopolitical. It is the power to make presidents beg, the power to decide whether economies grow or collapse, the power to determine, at a single meeting, whether the cost of living for billions of people goes up or down. But the desert kings are not resting easy. Because for the first time in a century, oil itself is under threat. The rise of electric vehicles, the expansion of solar and wind energy, government mandates in Europe and the United States pushing toward carbon neutrality. These are not distant possibilities. They are already happening. In 2023, electric vehicle sales crossed 10 million globally. In some European countries, new petrol car sales are already declining. Saudi Arabia sees this. And the response has been extraordinary. MBE's launched Vision 2030, a massive plan to transform Saudi Arabia's economy away from oil dependency before the world stops needing oil. Saudi Arabia is building NEOM, a futuristic megacity in the desert valued at $500 billion. It is investing in tourism, technology, sports, and entertainment, buying golf leagues, sponsoring boxing matches, acquiring football clubs. But here is the paradox. To fund Vision 2030, Saudi Arabia needs oil revenue. And to maximize oil revenue before the energy transition arrives, it needs to pump and sell as much oil as possible, as fast as possible. Saudi Aramco is simultaneously the engine that funds Saudi Arabia's future and the problem that future is trying to escape. The Desert Kings built their empire on a resource the world could not live without. For nearly a century, that resource gave them a power that no military force and no diplomatic relationship could match. They used it to bankrupt Western economies. They used it to fund revolutions. They used it to make themselves untouchable. Today, that power still holds. Every gallon of gas you pump, every flight you take, every product you buy that was shipped across an ocean, every one of those transactions sends money flowing back toward the desert. Saudi Aramco remains the most profitable company on earth. OPEC remains the most powerful economic alliance in history. And the men who control them remain some of the most influential people in the world. Not because of armies, not because of elections, but because the world still runs on what lies beneath their sand. The only question is, how much longer?